The wind rolled across the open prairie like a whispered hymn, brushing through the tall grasses and carrying dust across the bare wooden floor of the chapel. Rhett McAllister stood inside the simple structure he had built with his own 2 hands, staring at the handmade altar beneath the open rafters. The building was plain, no stained glass, no polished Puja's pine walls, a cross carved from driftwood, and beams that still smelled of fresh-cut timber. But to Rhett, it was sacred. It was where he had planned to begin again, with someone beside him for once in his lonely life. For over 10 years, Rhett had lived alone on that wild stretch of Wyoming territory. He'd carved a life out of stone, wood, and blood, fighting off rustlers, chasing wolves from his cattle, and burying neighbors who had vanished into the harsh silence of the frontier. He spoke little, laughed less, and never let anyone close. His land was hard, and so was he. But even the toughest ground could grow something if you tended it long enough. Rhett had begun to feel the ache of emptiness, an ache that years of labor and solitude couldn't cure. A year earlier, in the quiet hours of a winter storm, he had done something that felt almost foolish. He answered a mail-order bride advertisement. From Illinois, her name was Eleanor Gray. She had lost her family to sickness and dreamed of a new life far from factories and grief. Her letters had been steady, kind, filled with curiosity about his world and honesty about her fears. She wasn't looking for a rich man or a soft life, just one more chance to belong. In Rhett's chest, a door creaked open that he hadn't touched in years. They had agreed on a date. Eleanor would take the train west, then the coach to Dawson Pass, and from there, she'd be escorted by a ranch hand named Briggs, who knew the land well. Rhett spent the last 6 weeks preparing for her arrival like a man possessed. He painted the barn doors red, built a proper fence around the vegetable patch, and even trimmed the wildflowers that grew near the chapel. He bought blue calico fabric from the general store and draped it across the altar as a gift. On the night before her arrival, he barely slept, and now, on this cloudless morning, Rhett stood in his best shirt, boots polished, and beard trimmed short. He paced the steps of the chapel, glancing up the dusty trail every few minutes, waiting for the sight of a coach or the shimmer of a bonnet. Every gust of wind made his heart skip. Every shadow on the trail made his hopes rise. But nothing came. By mid-morning, the sun burned high in the sky. The birds had gone silent, and the road remained empty. Rhett's boots creaked against the wooden floor as he stepped outside and scanned the prairie. There was no movement, no rider, no wagon, just the vast stretch of empty land he had always known, and the terrible absence of someone who was supposed to be there. He waited another hour, then another. When the sun hung heavy in the west, Rhett took off his hat and placed it gently on the altar, like a man laying down a prayer. He sat in the front pew, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. Life had taught him long ago that hope was a brittle thing. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe the coach never came. Maybe the letter got lost. Maybe this was just another empty promise in a life full of them. But as the sky began to turn orange and the light cast long shadows over the prairie, Rhett heard something faint at first, like a drumbeat far away. Then it grew louder, deeper. Not the rattling wheels of a stagecoach, not the soft jingle of reins or the creak of wagon leather. No, this was something else. The ground beneath his boots trembled. Rhett stood, stepped outside, and shaded his eyes. Over the crest of the ridge, where the sun was sinking low, a dark line began to form. Horses, dozens at first, then hundreds. Men on horseback, moving in formation, their silhouettes bristling with weapons, feathers, and banners. The light caught the glint of spears and rifles. The air trembled with the thunder of hooves. 400 native warriors were riding straight toward him. Rhett didn't move. He didn't run. He simply stood at the chapel steps, heart pounding in his chest, and whispered the name he had hoped to speak at the altar. Eleanor. The sound was unmistakable. Now hoofbeats, hundreds of them, rolling like distant thunder across the wide Wyoming plains. Rhett McAllister remained rooted to the steps of his chapel, staring into the horizon where the sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills. What he saw didn't make sense. There, emerging like ghosts from the burning edge of dusk, was a column of mounted warriors, stretching across the ridge like a tide of shadows. They weren't galloping, not charging, but moving at a steady, deliberate pace as if they had come for something specific, or someone. Rhett's first instinct was caution. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked easily. His hands didn't tremble, even when he'd faced down rustlers or buried neighbors who didn't survive the long winters. But this was different. This was no scouting party. It was a force, a procession. 400 warriors, maybe more, descending into his valley. Their faces were painted in the hues of war, stripes of red and white, circles of black over eyes, feathers trailing behind them like streamers caught in wind. Their horses bore bone decorations and stitched hides. Many carried spears or bows. Others held long rifles across their saddles. He should have run. He should have retreated to the barn, loaded his rifle, and braced for the worst. But something in their formation, in the solemn weight of their approach, told Rhett this wasn't a raid. It wasn't anger or greed riding toward him. It was purpose. Still, he needed to be ready. Slowly, he stepped backward through the chapel doors, reached behind the altar, and pulled out the old Winchester he kept there. He didn't raise it, he simply held it at his side, barrel down, and returned to the front steps. He placed his boot on the lowest stair, shoulders squared. The lead rider reached the edge of the clearing and reined in his horse. The others followed. His signal, halting in perfect silence. It was like watching a wave freeze McCrash. The only sound now was the wind brushing through the grass, the faint rattle of harness beads, and the occasional snort of a tired stallion. Then, the leader dismounted. He was older than the rest, tall, broad, with graying braids that fell over a painted deerskin vest. A scar curved from his temple to the corner of his jaw. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. He walked with calm authority toward Rhett, stopping a few paces short. Neither man spoke. The air felt thick with everything unsaid. Then the elder reached into his vest and pulled out something smaller, folded piece of paper. He held it out slowly, as if it might break. Rhett stared at it, confused. "What's that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The elder didn't answer. He only nodded once, firmly. Rhett took the paper with calloused fingers, unfolding it carefully. The writing was delicate, almost fragile. His heart clenched as he recognized the familiar curve of the pen strokes. Eleanor's handwriting. Were only a few lines, but they hit harder than any blow. "Rhett, I didn't make it. We were attacked by men near Red Horse Crossing. They took me. I don't know where they're taking me, or why. If someone finds this, tell Rhett I tried. I'm sorry." Eleanor, the words blurred as Rhett's throat tightened. His hands dropped to his sides, the note fluttering in the wind like a dying leaf. For a long time, he couldn't speak. He could only stare at the horizon, as if willing her to appear out of the fading light. Then the elder spoke, not in English, but in Lakota, his tone low and solemn. Another younger warrior stepped forward and translated. "She was under our protection," the man said. "One of ours, a scout, was guiding her. The men who took her, they trade women like cattle. They killed the scout, but not before he escaped with the note." Rhett's jaw clenched. "Why bring it to me?" The elder stepped closer, placing a firm hand over his heart. Then he said a single word in English. "Honor." The translator added, "She spoke your name before the fight," she said. "Tell Rhett. That name was carried across many fires. The elder here, he is my father gathered warriors. They come not for war, but for justice." Rhett glanced past them, at the silent army that had waited with discipline and patience, their presence both a warning and a vow. 400 warriors had ridden for one reason, because a woman who was not of their people had spoken a name with love in her voice, and because that name had meaning. Rhett looked down at the note one more time, then folded it and placed it against his chest. "When do we ride?" he asked. The elder's lips curved just slightly. He raised a hand, gave a signal, and behind him, the warriors began to move, again toward the fire, toward the plan, toward the men who had stolen what didn't belong to them. By the time night fell, the meadow outside Rhett's chapel had transformed into a camp unlike anything he had ever seen. Fires dotted the tall grass like stars fallen to the earth, and the quiet air was filled with the low murmur of Lakota voices, the distant clatter of horses being watered, and the rhythmic beat of ceremonial drums. Rhett sat near the largest fire, staring into the flames. The letter from Eleanor tucked inside his shirt close to his heart. Like a vow, he hadn't yet spoken aloud. He didn't speak Lakota, but he listened closely. The language was full of rhythm, subtle gestures, and respect. Warriors spoke in low tones, sitting in circles, sharpening knives or repairing gear. Young boys ran errands, carrying water and furs. Women moved silently, some tending the sick, others preparing meals. It wasn't just a war party, it was a traveling nation, and Rhett was now caught in its current. Earlier that evening, the elder, the same man who had delivered Eleanor's note, had sat beside Rhett. He placed a small bundle in the rancher's lap and motioned for him to open it. Inside was a folded war shirt, hand-stitched with beadwork, eagle feathers, and bone buttons. Rhett looked up in confusion. "It is not costume," the translator had said quietly. "It is trust. When one wears it, he rides with us. He fights. With us, he is counted." Rhett hesitated. He had always kept to himself, always stood apart. The ranch, the chapel, the fences, he had built them to keep others out. But tonight, none of that mattered. Eleanor was out there somewhere, taken, sold, alone, and these people, strangers in name, but not in spirit, had chosen to stand with him, not for money, not for reward, but because her cry had reached them, because his name had meant something. In the end, he slipped the shirt on. It was a strange fit tied across the shoulders, light as a whisper down the arms. But when he stood, something changed. He wasn't just Rhett McAllister, the rancher, anymore. He was part of a cause. A fire had been lit, and now it was moving. Later, as the stars wheeled overhead and the wind grew colder, the elders gathered for council. Rhett was invited to sit with them. A map was drawn on hide using charcoal and ash. The translator pointed to a river bend. "Red Horse Crossing. This is where the girl was taken. 4 days ago. We tracked the print 6 horses. Men with no markings, no tribe. They do not ride with honor. They take women and trade them to white men miners, smugglers, brothels in distant towns. Rhett clenched his fists. And no one stops them. The translator gave a tired look. The army does not see, the law does not come this far, but we do. Another warrior spoke, young Fearside. The translator added, he says we leave at first light. We follow them east. They cannot outrun this many. Rhett nodded, but his mind was racing. 400 riders. Wouldn't that draw attention? Leave a trail like a scar across the prairie. He voiced the concern, and the elder merely smiled. We move like wolves, said the translator, split into packs. Surround, close. The fire snapped, sending sparks upward. Rhett looked into the flame and remembered Eleanor's last words. Tell Rhett, I tried. I'm sorry, as if she had failed him. As if her courage facing down armed men in a foreign land had been a disappointment. No, he whispered. Aloud, you didn't fail. He stood and turned to the elder. I ride with you. I'll find her, or bury the ones who took her. The elder placed a hand on Rhett's shoulder. Then we are brothers, he said, in careful English. From this night, the rest of the night passed in hushed preparation. Arrows were checked, saddles tightened, waterskins filled. Rhett walked among the warriors, helping where he could, learning where he couldn't. He noticed something else. No one mocked him. No one questioned his presence. They treated him as one of their own. And when dawn finally crept over the hills and lit the meadow in gold, the war drums began again, soft, steady, like a heart beginning to beat faster. Horses were mounted, eyes turned east. Rhett tightened the war shirt across his chest, mounted his black mare, and nodded once to the elder. The hunt for Eleanor had begun. The sun had barely broken the rim of the earth when the warriors began to ride. A mist still curled along the grass like ghost smoke, and the prairie was quiet except for the rhythmic hoofbeats of hundreds of horses moving as one. It was not a charge. It was not a parade. It was a hunt. Silent, deliberate, and ancient. Rhett McAllister rode near the front, his mare's dark mane brushing his gloved hands. The war shirt still felt foreign on his shoulders, but he wore it with purpose. Now, he wasn't just riding for Eleanor. He was riding with men who had lived their entire lives by codes of honor, vengeance, and kinship. They had taken him in without question, not as a stranger, but as someone bound by a shared wound. The Lakota scouts rode ahead in small groups, slipping through the terrain like shadows. Every so often, one would return to the main party with a word or a gesture, and the formation would adjust. No commands were shouted. No maps were needed. They read the land as if it breathed beneath them. By midday, they reached Red Horse Crossing, where Eleanor's note had been found. It was a shallow river with slow-moving water, flanked by cottonwood trees and streaks of gravel. The scouts dismounted and began to examine the area. Scuff marks in the dirt, broken branches, drag lines near the riverbank. Rhett followed the lead scout, watching closely. One man crouched near the water's edge and pointed to a spot where the reeds had been crushed flat. Someone struggled here, the translator said quietly. She fought. Rhett's jaw clenched. He knelt beside the spot and found a torn piece of fabric blue calico, the same cloth he had laid across the chapel altar. His breath caught. She was here, he whispered. The elder nodded solemnly. They moved quickly from this point. East, 6 men, 2 pack horses. Heavy loads. They're selling them, Rhett said. Taking them to a broker or slaver. Yes, said the translator. There is a man near Fort Custer. He trades in women. Lakota, Cheyenne, white, doesn't matter. Pays riders too. Bring him. We have tracked him before. Rhett looked at him sharply. Then why hasn't anyone stopped him? The translator's eyes darkened. Because the army protects the town, and the army does not believe the stories. The elder raised a hand, and the camp broke into motion. Within minutes, fires were doused, waterskins filled, and horses resaddled. Rhett turned to the elder. How far ahead are they? The elder spoke briefly, and the translator replied, 2 days. If they stop to trade, we catch them. If not, we cut across Ghost Canyon. Reach them by dawn the 3rd day. Then let's ride, Rhett said, already mounting up. That night, they camped in a narrow valley, shielded by jagged rocks and twisted pines. Fires were kept low. The warriors moved like wolves, cautious and silent. Rhett couldn't sleep. He sat on a ledge above the camp, staring at the stars, remembering Eleanor's letters, how she had written about her fear of being alone, how she dreamed of prairie skies, and how she imagined their wedding with a bouquet of wildflowers. He felt the presence beside him and turned to see the elder had joined him. They sat together without speaking for a long time. Finally, the elder said in slow English, when my wife was taken, I followed alone. I did not wait. I did not gather warriors. I went like fire. I found her too late. Rhett lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. The elder nodded. So now, I ride for all stolen women, all stolen daughters. Rhett looked back at the fire below. Do you think we'll find her alive? The elder didn't answer immediately. Then he said, if the wind is with us and her spirit still burns, we will find her. At dawn, they mounted up again, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. The trail was narrowing now, The signs grew fresher. A broken flask, boot prints, horse dung, still warm. By afternoon, the scout raised his fist. Everyone stopped. He pointed to the horizon. Smoke, camp, the translator whispered. Their camp. Rhett's heart pounded. He reached into his shirt and touched the folded note again. Eleanor was near, and so were the men who had taken her. The smoke was faint but unmistakable. It curled in thin spirals above the treetops, not the thick black kind that signals destruction, but the pale gray wisps of a controlled fire cooking, perhaps, or a morning blaze being tended lazily by men too confident to hide. Rhett McAllister sat astride his mare on the bluff. Eyes narrowed. He'd learned a lot in the past 3 days: how to ride in silence, how to read sign, how to watch for shifts in wind and birds. But what struck him most was the stillness of the Lakota warriors surrounding him. No one stirred, no one spoke. Their horses shifted softly beneath them, but the men remained as still as carved stone. It was as if the entire column of riders was holding its breath. A scout dismounted and dropped low, crawling toward the edge of the ridge. After a few tense minutes, he returned and whispered something in Lakota to the elder. The elder turned to the translator and gave a short nod. 6 men, the translator said to Rhett. 2 women, tied to a wagon wheel, alive. Rhett's heart thundered. One of them, is she wearing blue? The translator asked. Listened, then turned back. Yes, torn, but blue. Rhett nearly leaped off his horse. He gripped the reins hard instead. Then we go in now. We take them now. The elder raised a hand to steady him. No, the translator said gently. We wait. Plan their rifles. Are many, their backs are to the wagon. Women between them. If we charge, they kill before we reach. Rhett clenched his fists. Every muscle in his body screamed to act, to run straight into that camp and drag Eleanor out with his bare hands. If he had to, but they were right. Russian would get her killed. What's the plan then? He asked. The elder unrolled a small hide and began to draw lines with a charcoal stick. The warriors gathered around it, their eyes gleaming in the morning light. The translator explained as the strategy formed. We split in 3 groups, north, south, and west. Scouts circle behind, cut the escape. 1 signal, then we strike. What's the signal? The elder looked directly at Rhett, then said, in clear English, you. Rhett blinked me. You walk in, you speak, you stall. When they point guns at you and all eyes turn, we come. Rhett's mouth went dry. And if they shoot me on sight, the translator smiled grimly. Then we come faster. There was no time to hesitate. The sun was rising. The shadows would not hold forever. Rhett dismounted and removed the war shirt. He folded it gently, laying it over his saddle. He wore only his old ranch clothes, now dusty boots, a plain shirt, and the revolver on his hip. He wanted them to see a man, not a warrior, not a threat, just a man with nothing left to lose. The walk from the ridge to the camp was long and open. No cover. Every step was like walking a tightrope with no net. As he crested the last hill, the camp came into full view. 2 wagons, a dying fire, 6 filthy men with rifles and whiskey bottles. And near the second wagon, tied by her wrists to a broken wheel, was Eleanor. She looked thinner. Dirt smudged her cheek. Her dress was torn at the sleeve and stained with blood, but she was alive. Rhett stepped into the clearing. One of the men saw him and barked, "Who the hell?" Another raised his rifle. "Stop right there. I'm not armed," Rhett called. "Just here for the girl." The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a crooked nose and stained coat. "You lost, preacher. This ain't your chapel." Rhett took another step forward. "Her name is Eleanor. You don't own her." The man spat. "I paid good money. That means she's mine. You let her go, and you can keep your skin." This time they all laughed. Crooked Nose raised his rifle. "How about I take your scalp instead?" Rhett didn't blink. His eyes locked on Eleanor as hers widened in horror, then flicked toward the tree line behind the camp. A flicker of movement. Rhett nodded, ever so slightly. Then he shouted, "Now!" From all sides, the forest exploded. Lakota warriors burst from the trees like lightning, unleashed, howling, arrows flying, horses thundering into the camp. The slavers barely had time to react. One man dropped before he could aim. Another screamed as a tomahawk struck his rifle from his hands. Panic overtook them. Rhett ran straight toward Eleanor, cutting her free as arrows whistled past. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief, clutching his shirt as if to make sure he was real. "You came," she whispered. "I said I would," he replied. "Now let's get you home." The fight was over in moments. When the dust settled, not a single slaver was left standing. But the war for justice, for Eleanor's soul, was only just beginning. The battle had lasted no more than 5 minutes, yet in Rhett's memory, it stretched into eternity. Now, the forest clearing was quiet, again too quiet. Smoke curled from the campfire's remains, and the scent of blood and pine sap mingled. On the morning air, crows circled above, already sensing what had passed. Eleanor sat beside Rhett, wrapped in a buffalo hide one of the Lakota women had given her. She was shaking, but her tears had stopped. Her wrists were red and raw from the rope burns. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I thought I'd never see you again." Rhett didn't answer at first. He took her hand gently, his calloused fingers closing around hers. Neither of us gave up, he finally said. That's why we're here. Around them, the Lakota warriors moved with purpose, tending the wounded, gathering weapons, checking the bodies of the slavers. It was brutal business, but quiet and clean. They did not revel in the violence. They treated the victory like duty, fulfilled, not vengeance taken. The elder approached Rhett and Eleanor, his weathered face as unreadable as stone. The translator followed close behind. She is safe, the elder said, but she is not whole. Time will heal her spirit. Rhett nodded. And the other woman, she was taken further east. Sold days earlier, the men we captured say she was traded to a brothel in Deadwood. Eleanor looked up sharply. We have to help her. The elder raised an eyebrow at the urgency, but at the way her voice had regained strength. You are one of us now, he said. If you choose to be. Rhett stood. His spine ached. His legs were stiff, but the fire in his chest was burning bright. You helped me get her back. Now we help the next. The translator nodded with quiet approval. Few white men would say such words. I'm not like most, Rhett replied. The elder gave a single nod, then turned away to speak with his riders. The plan would begin again: tracking, scouting, hunting. They would ride until the stolen girl was found, just like Eleanor. As the warriors prepared to move, Eleanor leaned against Rhett's shoulder. Why did they come? Why would they risk their lives for a girl they didn't know? Rhett looked around the camp. The Lakota riders weren't just warriors, they were fathers, brothers, sons. They had all lost someone to greed and violence. They knew what it meant to be stolen. It wasn't just about you, Rhett said softly. It was about what you represent. A woman stolen and silenced. A bride who never got to say, I do. You reminded them of their own. And maybe you reminded me of something too.
What's that?
He met her eyes. That a name means something. A vow means something. I waited at that altar, not because I was alone, but because I believed someone was worth waiting for. Eleanor blinked, her throat tightening. You really did wait. Every day, he said. I built that chapel for you. I fixed the pews, set the candles. I even baked the wedding bread. She gave a watery laugh. I would have burned the bread. That's why I didn't let you make it. They sat in silence for a moment, sharing the kind of stillness only survivors know. The kind that comes not from peace, but from coming through the fire together. Later that evening, the Lakota scouts returned with news. The trail to Deadwood was fresh. Recent wagon wheels. A driver and 2 armed men headed north along the river road. The girl was still with them, according to a trapper who'd seen the group pass just the day before. Eleanor sat up. I'm riding with you. No, Rhett said gently. You need rest. I've rested long enough. The elder overheard and nodded solemnly. She has warrior blood. Rhett smiled, despite the worry tightening in his chest. You sure you're ready? Eleanor tied back her hair, fire in her eyes. They thought I was weak. They thought they broke me. But I'm still standing. And now I've got 400 warriors at my back. The camp erupted into movement. Once more, horses saddled, weapons checked, scouts leading the way. The wind shifted. The chase was on again, and this time, Eleanor would ride beside them. They rode through the night. Moonlight poured over the prairie like silver dust, lighting their path across the open land. The horses galloped in long, tireless strides. Not one rider faltered, not Rhett, not Eleanor, and not the 400 Lakota warriors who had made this mission their own. The earth trembled beneath their charge, but no one spoke. This was not a ride of celebration. It was a ride of reckoning. Rhett kept Eleanor close, his eyes flicking to her now and then. She rode like someone born in the saddle, her back straight, her jaw set in iron. The transformation was undeniable. The girl, who had collapsed at his door, beaten and trembling, was gone. In her place rode a woman shaped by fire, grief, and defiance. Just before dawn, the lead scouts signaled a halt. They crested a low ridge overlooking a dusty road that ran northward like a scar through the grassland. Below, 2 men sat by a small campfire beside a wagon. Their rifles lay nearby. Inside the wagon, something stirred. A soft cry, muffled. Fradzul, she's there, Eleanor whispered. The other girl. Rhett nodded grimly. They think they're safe. The elder rode up, dismounted, and crouched behind the brush. He looked to the translator, who turned to Rhett and Eleanor. We surround. No blood, if possible. If they shoot, we end them. Eleanor's eyes burned. They won't leave this field with her. The warriors moved like phantoms, spreading in all directions, their presence swallowed by the tall grass and morning mist. Rhett crouched beside Eleanor as they watched the final moments of stillness. Then the elder gave the signal. A piercing hawk cry. In seconds, warriors erupted from all sides, bows drawn, rifles aimed, horses charging. The 2 slavers scrambled for their weapons, but one took an arrow to the shoulder before he could raise his gun. The other ran straight into Rhett's path. Rhett didn't draw his weapon. He met the man with a full tackle, knocking him into the dirt. They rolled, fists flying, until Rhett pinned him. Where is she? Rhett snarled. In the wagon. The man choked. Eleanor was already there. She ripped the canvas open and found a girl barely older than 16, bruised and shaking. Eleanor untied her, wrapped her arms around her, and whispered over and over, "You're safe now. It's over." When the dust settled, the slavers were tied and disarmed. No warriors were injured. No blood spilled needlessly. But justice had been served. Rhett stood by Eleanor as she helped the girl drink water. The warriors watched in reverent silence. The elder approached and knelt beside the girl. He spoke gently in Lakota. She nodded, slowly, eyes wide, but less afraid. "She is Cheyenne," the translator said, "taken from her family 6 weeks ago." "She's going home," Eleanor said firmly. The elder nodded. "We ride there next." But Rhett hesitated. "And what about us?" It was the first time he'd asked the question aloud. Eleanor looked up at him, her face calm but unsure. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what we started," he said. "That chapel, that vow. I waited for a bride. I didn't expect a war, but I found a woman I'd ride into hell for." She was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "Let's ride her home. Then we build ours." Rhett smiled. "Together." Eleanor nodded. "Together." The warriors cheered when the girl stood, leaning on Eleanor, and gave a quiet thank you. Rhett took one final look at the slavers, still on their knees, stripped of their power. Then he mounted his horse, helped Eleanor up behind him, and together, they turned toward the sunrise. This wasn't just about a rescue anymore, it was about something deeper than blood or vows. It was about rebuilding a world where stolen women rode free, and the men who took them were made to answer. It was nearly dusk by the time they reached the Cheyenne village, a quiet place, nestled in a shallow valley beside a river lined with willows. Smoke drifted from the lodges. Children played near the water, but when the girl stepped down from Eleanor's arms, the whole village stopped. A single voice called out a woman's cry, sharp and quivering, and then a figure ran from one of the lodges. The girl saw her, and without a word, she broke into a run. Mother and daughter met in the center of the village with an embrace that sent a ripple through every soul who saw it. Eleanor turned away, her throat tightening. Rhett placed a hand on her back. "That's why we came." "I know," she whispered, "but it doesn't make the past easier. It just gives it purpose." The Lakota riders were welcomed with food, drums, and gifts from the Cheyenne. Fires were lit, peace offerings shared. For a while, it felt like the pain of both tribes of both histories could finally rest. But for Rhett and Eleanor, the time had come to return west, not as fugitives, not as victims, but as builders, rebuilders. They rode alone the next morning, the open land stretching before them like a clean canvas. Rhett guided the horses with confidence now, and Eleanor, no longer, leaned to hold herself steady. She rode tall, proud. When the chapel came into view, it was exactly as Rhett had left it and finished. The door hung crooked, the window frames were empty, and dust covered the pews. But it still stood. Rhett dismounted first, brushing dust from the altar as Eleanor stepped through the open doorway. "So this is where you waited?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Every Sunday, just in case." She touched the frame of the doorway. "I thought I'd never step into a place like this again." "You don't have to," he said. "Not unless you choose to." She turned to face him, her eyes softer now, steadier. "I choose to." They worked side by side for days, cleaning, hammering, recutting wood where rot had set in. Eleanor painted the window frames with wildflower colors. Rhett carved new pews and sanded the altar smooth. The town had long forgotten the chapel's purpose, but a few neighbors rode by, curious, when they saw Eleanor, bruises fading, hands stained with paint. They didn't ask questions, they just nodded respectfully and brought what help they could. By the end of the week, the chapel gleamed in the morning light, small and humble, but complete. On a quiet Sunday morning, the two stood outside in the prairie wind, dressed simply. No guests, no choir, no priest, just Rhett and Eleanor. He reached into his vest and pulled out a hand-woven ring-braided leather and beadwork, gifted by the Lakota elder before they left. Eleanor smiled and slid it onto her finger. "You waited for a bride," she whispered. "Now you've got a partner." He nodded, "And a fighter." They stepped inside the chapel and closed the door, not to shut out the world, but to start something new within it. As the wind moved across the plains, the chapel stood firm, not just as a house of vows, but as a monument to what two people can rebuild after being broken.